Hello and welcome to the AAMFT Podcast, your all-access pass to the latest news, developments, and thought leaders in the world of systemic therapy, where we strive to relate, educate, and innovate one episode at a time. I'm your host, Dr. Eli Karam, and we're brought to you by the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. In addition to featuring unique conversation and interviews with established experts, our show provides information and education on direct practice and emerging trends in the MFT profession. For more information, please visit us at aamft.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
Step inside, take a seat, let's explore the world of therapy like never before. Dr. Eli's here, bringing voices so bright, innovating, relating, and shedding you light. It's AAMFT, where wisdom meets passion. Come listen and see, talking trends, deep insights, and stories so bold. For MFT minds, the future unfolds. Stay systemic, my friends. We relate, educate, and innovate again. Stay systemic, my friends. Stay systemic, my friends. Stay systemic, my friends. We relate, educate, and innovate again, one episode at a time. At a time. One episode at a time.
Systemic therapists have a unique and challenging opportunity of helping clients find deeper connection in their intimate relationships. Instead of extended exploration of these relational aspects, traditional psychotherapy research has increasingly focused on empirically validated methods and interventions. All the while, frontline clinicians, like the listeners of our show, have long understood the therapeutic relationship, the alliance, to be the most powerful meta-intervention for fostering client change and system-wide transformation. On this episode of the AAMFT Podcast, I'm going to talk to two long-term colleagues and friends, Stephen Fife and Jason Whiting, to discuss the importance of way of being for MFTs and systemic therapists. They're going to argue throughout the next hour that many clinicians apply therapeutic models and interventions designed to help individuals, couples, and families. However, many of these models are derived from theoretical, scientific, and social cultural traditions that conceptualize human phenomena as individualistic and reductionistic. And the language in these theories may not match the client's experiences or worldview. Their writing over the past decade, along with their colleagues, has been greatly influenced by the work of Martin Buber. According to philosopher Buber, an interpersonal encounter contains wonderful potential that far exceeds two separate people in conversation. This potential becomes apparent when two people actively and authentically engage each other in here and now and truly show up for one another. In this encounter, a new relational dimension that Buber termed the between becomes manifest. When this between dimension exists, the relationship becomes greater than the individual contributions of those involved. Truly, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. This is what Buber described as an I-thou relationship. The I-thou relationship is characterized by mutuality, directness, and the ability to remain present while in relationship. Buber contrasted this I-thou relationship with an I-it relationship, and that's which the other person is experienced as an object to be influenced or used. So today we'll talk about integrating Buber's work into both the practice and training of MFT. After all, as systemic therapists, we must be someone with rather than do something to the client system. Stephen Fife, PhD, LMFT, is associate professor and the director of the doctoral program at Texas Tech University. His scholarly activities center around two broad goals: improving the quality of treatment in couple therapy and providing high quality training for MFT graduate students. Dr. Jason Whiting, PhD LMFT, is the program director of the MFT program at Brigham Young University. There he researches healthy and unhealthy intimate relationships and publishes academically in areas around abuse control and communication. He's also written for general audiences, including books that your couples might read: Love Me True, Overcoming the Surprising Ways We Deceive in Relationships, and he has regular blogs on Psychology Today. Respected these gentlemen for a long time, and their invitation to the podcast was long overdue. I really enjoyed the authenticity and thoughtfulness of this interview, and I hope you will too. We'll be back after we talk to Jason and Steve. Jason and Steve, welcome to the AAMFT podcast. I have known you guys and admired your work for a long time, so we're finally getting to do this today, building on really over the last decade, you and your colleagues on this concept of way of being in therapy. And what spurred me onto this, other than, wanting to have you on for a while, was this recent article I read in Family Process, one of our gold standard journals in MFT and in family studies, that we will reference today. But first, as you guys know on the show, we always like to know about the psychotherapeutic origin story. And for both of you guys, it's like me, it's in MFT. So your MFT origin story, and then the history of the friendship and professional collaboration between Jason and Steve. I want to know about that too. Whoever wants to start, go ahead.
Wow. That's great. Yeah. Thanks, Eli. It is great to be here with you. And we've been an admirer of your work for a long time as well. But the real quick version of the origin story, which sounds a little bit like a supervillain type of story or something like that. But I just grew up thinking about the big questions, maybe. What's it all for? What's the deal with life? Why is there so much? When you turn on the radio, you hear these songs about, it's all about love and life and pain and what makes us tick and what makes us happy. So I think I just gravitated towards this field as the kind of place where we can sit with people and explore, why are we so drawn to each other? Why do we fall in love? And then why does it sometimes go so wrong and there's pain and confusion? I just think those are fascinating questions. This is a great fit for me to be splashing around in this field, working with people closely with their lives and then talking to students and talking to great colleagues like yourself. So I'll let Steve introduce himself and then we can talk a little more about our collaborative relationship as well.
Yeah. Thanks again, Eli, for the invitation, and excited to be able to chat with both of you. Yeah, my origin story, similar to Jason, just a natural curiosity about people and just what makes us tick. Originally, I was an undergraduate psychology major, and I wasn't aware of marriage and family therapy as a discipline at the time. And so my target was a clinical psychology graduate program, PhD program. Fortunately, and I say fortunately now, I didn't get into any of the programs I applied for. At the time, it was devastating. But what I had for a plan B was a master's degree in psychology, a non-clinical psychology degree. And I chose the track that was an emphasis in theoretical psychology. So it was a theory and philosophical psychology master's degree. And in that degree, we did a lot of critiques of traditional psychological theories and models, especially critiquing the individualistic perspective that most psychotherapy models are grounded in. And we studied some alternative perspectives. We looked at relational perspectives on human beings and human behaviors. And that really resonated with me. And I thought, this is what I want to study. Where do I go to find more of this? And that's what led me to marriage and family therapy, the systemic worldview. And so that was really exciting to hear about that. I briefly considered a few clinical psychology programs that said they had an emphasis or taught family psychology, but I quickly realized that those programs generally were grounded in the traditional psychological worldview and just had a couple of classes tacked on that were couple therapy or family therapy. But MFT really was systemic and relational from the ground up. And that's what led me into the field of marriage and family therapy. And the doctoral program also has got me excited about research and theoretical writing and things, which is what led me into an academic position.
And the origin of you guys meeting and becoming friends and professional colleagues.
It's funny, we didn't put this together until later. We were both psychology undergraduates in the same program at the same university, at BYU, Brigham Young University. And at the time, Steve was pursuing clinical psychology. I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. And I was looking into marriage and family therapy, but I was also interested, similarly, in theoretical issues in psychology. So I applied for two things. I applied for the marriage and family therapy master's, and I applied for that same master's degree that Steve was just describing in theoretical issues in psychology. I got into the psychology one and I was about to do that, but then I got an interview in the family therapy program, really liked it, and barely squeaked in as an alternate. So anyway, our paths, although they were similar, we didn't even know each other at the time. Where we converged was several years later when I was finishing my PhD and got on as a temporary faculty at the University of Kentucky, so just down the road from you. And Steve had reached out to them to do a doctoral internship at the same place. We didn't know each other, but we both showed up at the same time. And the department chair said, "Hey, we don't have a lot of office space, so we're sticking you guys in the same office. Have fun with that." And that was fun. We immediately developed a good friendship and had a lot of the same interests and started talking about some of these ideas that we're still talking about 20 plus years later. So that's the story.
That is so awesome. I knew parts of that story, but to hear it and yeah, the rest is history. And you guys have, as will come through in our talk today, a great overlap personally and professionally. If you're not familiar with the work of my friends here today, let's start out orienting our listeners to what is referred to as a therapist way of being. You guys are taking that from the work of Martin Buber in these articles over the last decade. And it basically proposes two fundamental relational stances, which I'd like you guys to talk about. I, thou, and I, it. What are those and what are the major differences between them?
Eli, one of the things in that theoretical psychology master's program is we studied the work of Martin Buber. Martin Buber, along with some other scholars, were looking at human beings as fundamentally relational beings, in contrast to more of an individualistic perspective of human beings. They argue that human beings are fundamentally relational. And so Buber's work looks at human beings, and he said that in any given moment, each of us is relating to others in one of two ways, either the I, thou way or the I, it way. And some people will look at that as two separate, mutually exclusive ways of being, and other people frame it as a continuum. But either way, he said that there was this I, thou way of being. And just to orient readers, Martin Buber was a Jewish philosopher that was born in Austria and grew up in Austria and Germany and even a little bit in the Ukraine. And he was a brilliant thinker and read all the philosophers of his day and earlier and became a philosophy professor. But he spoke German, and I don't speak German, but I guess in the Romantic languages, the Latin-based languages, there's two ways of saying you. One is a more formal way, and the other is a familiar, intimate way of you. And in Old English, thou was the familiar, intimate form of you. So we just say you, we just have one in English. So I, thou, we don't say thou a lot in our contemporary language, but that's this intimate connection. And the I, it, and the I, thou, the I refers to the subject or the person themselves. And then the thou or the it refers to other people. So in the I, thou way of relating to others, we see them as people, that we're alive to their humanity and responsive to them as a person. So just like each of us have our own hopes and dreams and challenges and objectives, we recognize that others have their hopes and dreams and objectives and challenges and needs that they have those going on in their lives, and we're mindful of those, and those count to us just like our own do. In contrast, the I, it, for the it, others are essentially objects to us, that we regard them as things that we can either use for our benefit, they're vehicles to help us get what we want or accomplish our objectives, or they're obstacles. They're things that are in our ways or our irritations or interruptions to our plans. And so I started learning about these things. I thought it was really fascinating. But what really struck me as I was thinking about this was the relationship implications. What does it do when two people are relating to each other, either as objects or they're people that are relating to others truly as people? And the I-it way tends to push people apart and make it challenging to get along and to work through problems and to solve issues in a relationship. The I-thou way of being with other people, though, is more collaborative. It promotes mutual respect and responsiveness to one another, and it tends to bring people together. So as I started relating these things to family therapy, I thought, oh, wow, there's some pretty significant practical implications to these ideas. Jason, what would you add there?
Just to follow up with some examples. And so this at a very practical level, we move back and forth between these ways of being. So just as one example, and it's a pretty common one, I have kids, and if I were to come home tired and wiped out from work, I might want to just sit down and chill out and do a crossword puzzle or do Wordle or recover or get a snack or whatever. But if in that moment where I'm thinking about my own needs, my kids, I hear them bickering in the other room, for example. If I'm in an I-it mode, they are now an obstacle to my goal of chilling out and to focusing on my needs. If I'm in an I-thou mode, I'm more alive to them as the individuals and the people who they are. And I think, what do they need? And how can I be responsive to that? And sometimes it's as simple as that. And sometimes it's a little more dramatic to where in couples therapy, say, and maybe we'll come back to this more, but couples often come in a position of this person has become an impediment to my happiness. They are getting in the way. I'm arguing with them. And sometimes in cases, I study domestic violence and abuse, sometimes people become so objectified that they see the other person as worthy of punishment or inhumane treatment. And so just our species has this ability to swing back and forth from being very humane and responsive and caring to very inhumane and contemptuous and condescending and even aggressive. And sometimes those are in really small ways and quickly back and forth ways of relating. And other times they're in big and significant ways.
I love those examples. Let's give some other examples now, what that would look like in the therapy room, I-it versus I-thou.
You know, Steve and I started talking about this way back in the day in Lexington, and that evolved into one of the publications that came out about 10 years ago where we talked about, as therapists, we need to be aware of our own way of being. And incidentally, this idea of way of being, Carl Rogers wrote a whole book about it. There's a lot of different ways to think about how we respond to the person in front of us. But as a therapist, we can see the people that come to visit with us, our clients. We can see them in objectifying ways, including as a diagnosis only, or as a difficult client, or there was a project that Steve and I were involved with a colleague's research where he was interviewing clients about their experiences in therapy. And I remember one of them said, I felt like I was just a puzzle to be solved. And he contrasted that with another experience with a different therapist who said, I felt like he really saw me. He got who I was. And so that's just a quick overview of some of the ways we can become I-it versus I-thou as therapists. One time I was supervising a therapist who, she brought this situation to me and she said, I cannot get this guy to do his homework. And this battle had been going on for weeks, where every week she'd say, have you done your homework? And he'd say, no, I didn't do my homework. And she'd say, you got to do your homework. And my question for her was about the importance of the homework. Had it become more important than the person? Was it more important for her to be obeyed, say, or to be, for her treatment plan to be followed than it was to ask the question, maybe this isn't a good fit for this person or wherever he's at or what's going on with him. And it's that kind of thing can happen, and our jobs can be difficult, and we can be difficult, and our clients can be difficult. So it's just easy to shift in and out of it versus I-thou as therapists. But I definitely think it makes an impact on the kind of relationship and then therefore the kinds of outcomes that happen.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we believe about these ways of being is that people generally have a sense of how we regard them. So they're not just responding to our behaviors, but they sense, are we coming at this interaction from an I-it place or an I-thou place? And when Martin Buber, he said that you can do just about any behavior from an I-it way or from an I-thou way. And therapists can implement their treatment plans or apply a model or intervention an I-it way or an I-thou way. And I know from my own experience, there's been times where I've put my model or my game plan for the session as primary and my client was secondary. I was viewing my client as an object and figuring out like the game plan. I think maybe I started out, most of the time, I think I start out like, what can I do for this client, not to this client, and how can I be helpful? But there was one session in particular, Jason and I have talked about this, where I got the sense that this client would really benefit from a solution-focused approach. So I prepared and I was already armed with my solution-focused techniques and things. And I went into that session and I hardly knew the client because he was the husband of a woman that I had been working with for a little while. So I'd heard about him through her. And he decided he would come and meet with me. But I didn't really get to know him personally, but I'd already figured him out. And the session was a disaster. Like it just was a grind and nothing seemed to be helpful. And it just, I walked out there feeling not good about myself or about the session. And I figured he probably didn't enjoy it either and probably wasn't even going to come back. And I told Jason about the session and he just laughed and he said, I know what happened. And I said, what? He goes, you tried to solution focus them into submission. And I thought that's like exactly what happened.
And you did a good job with the session, and I'm a fan of solution focus where I use it a lot. But I think we all have those experiences where we at times get more focused on the intervention than the person or whether it's fitting for that person. So I just think it's a constant invitation for us to reflect about where are we in this process and where are we seeing the people in front of us in this process? Because as Steve said, we can all tell. That's actually just reminded me of the time I was using communication skills with a couple. And it was similar. I was just kept putting this guy in his place saying, it's not your turn to speak. You've got to listen and reflect and summarize. And in his case, he was having a hard time being I-thou as well. And he kept wanting to interrupt. And finally, he got so frustrated that he fell off his chair and was flopping around on the floor, which I've not seen before or since in a session. But it was just this case of the intervention becoming the most important thing instead of being used in service of what was needed at that time.
I have a lot of thoughts what you guys have been saying. So here, let me go back because we were talking about our origin stories, and certainly the bread and butter of our audience is systemic thinkers, many of which are MFTs, but we have clinical psychologists and social workers and counselors listening to this show. So I don't want to offend anybody, but so I'll just speak on my own journey. So when I was also a psychology undergraduate, and I was in Chicago at Northwestern University, and I was being trained by brilliant minds, but to think of these people actually in a room with clients, they were researchers and maybe sometimes the only clinical work they did maybe was in their internship year or very minimal. So I think of clinical psychology and psychopathologizing is a very I certainly did not have Buber's language back then, but it was a real turnoff for me. And I think I'm someone that had always thought systemically in my own family of origin. And like you said, Jason, being curious about relationships. So when I found family therapy, it was really like a godsend in many ways and conducive with thinking in a I-thou way, I believe it, focusing on strength and healthy relationships. So we have that part that you said. And then also, as you all were talking about just in your stories, I think there's something about being a therapist in training, and we're all both trainers, educators as well. That's another reason I want to talk to you guys. So I think it may be somewhat developmentally normal. We used to say, fake it till you make it, to learn how to do therapy by thinking of the client or the client system in an I-it way. And we'll talk about your philosophies on training and the future of training therapist as we move on today, but those two thoughts struck me. You're preaching to the choir. I, thou seems a natural way of being in creating connection, building alliances with multiple members of a system, being authentic. What is the argument against being I, thou as an MFT?
It's a good question. And Steve, you may have other thoughts on this. For one, I'm struggling a little bit to come up with an example where it would be the preferred way to go. There may be people who would say, listen, we're professionals. You can't just become a fully invested, relational, connected person in every situation. And that's fair. Somebody might say, for example, you might have to refer somebody out. You might have to say, this guy needs to go to a battery intervention program. This person needs to go to an addiction recovery program. I need to challenge them and I need to be a little bit in their face as I do it. And that may all be true, but I would say even if you do those kinds of things, it's helpful to think in terms of what's the best thing for the client. If I have a good relationship with a client and they need to be challenged on some things and I can do that in a way, that may be the most I, thou loving kind of thing I can do. If I have a client who needs to go to a battery intervention program, that may also be the most appropriate thing to do. I was working with a client a little while ago who had gotten in a big argument with his attorney. And I was reading the emails that he had sent me and I felt like I needed to challenge him on some things that he had said and done and try to help him see why his attorney, had really taken some strong offense at the things he had said. And I said, look, I care about you. We've worked together for a long time, but this, I think, is coming across as aggressive or whiny I wasn't trying to call him those things. I was just helping him. I was trying to challenge him about that. So having said all that, I just think even in our most technical of endeavors as therapists, we can do it in an I, thou way. And even like things like diagnosing. I'm not arguing against diagnosing per se. I'm just saying sometimes it becomes a substitute for the relationship. Now, I have a kid on the autism spectrum. That's a useful diagnosis for us. I think sometimes it's very useful for people to get a psychiatric evaluation and say, you know what, there's maybe some serious things going on here that we need to understand. And the language of diagnosis is useful, or this intervention may be useful. But I just still would take the approach that can generally be done with a respect for and an awareness of the humanity of the person.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, Jason. I think a diagnosis has the risk of reducing a human being to a list of symptoms or categories and things like that. There was a time where where I was teaching and we had the students prepare these summary sheets that kind of had all their client number and how many sessions and the diagnosis and the consultation, individual, couple, and family. And then there was a column for the client's nickname. So they didn't want to put their full names on the sheet because they were carrying them around and stuff. But I looked at those nicknames and I thought, I'm not sure those are super kind. Some of them are not really caring nicknames. They seem to be somewhat maybe even teasing or making fun of the clients or putting the clients in a certain box, which might, again, the therapist without even really thinking of might be limiting their ability to be therapeutic if they're characterizing their clients in ways that suggest change isn't possible or sort of static characteristics about the client. So we talked about that and made some changes there. But yeah, it's I, it versus I, thou. Yeah, even the other day, some students had to make a CPS report. And so their initial anxieties were getting the best of them just because it's sometimes hard and scary to make a report. But we talked about what's the best way to do this, taking into consideration all the people involved. There's the kids and protecting them and safety. That's a high priority there. But what about the parent that was involved in this behavior? How do we take into account their humanity and their needs in this? Likely they will still be the parent and they may still be our client. So how do we go about the CPS report in a way that honors everyone's humanity and their kind of respective dignity? And it was a great experience to see these students working through that and coming up with a decision about how to go about the CPS report, including involving the dad in the process.
Oh man, your examples, both the nickname thing and the CPS report, make me think of and this way of being, our therapist language really impacts that. What are your guys' thoughts on how language impacts way of being?
Two things. It's a good question. One is the kind of thing Steve was just describing, which is how we talk about our clients and how we reduce them matters. And of necessity, we have to do that. There's always reduction going on. And again, this is part of the thing that we discuss in the paper, which is that our westernized language reduces people's experience into sort of an individualistic approach. And that's just the reality of how things work. You know, somebody comes to us and they have to reduce their lives with all of their richness and history and personality and background and experiences. They reduce that into 53 minutes of what they think is most useful for us to hear and what they think we want to hear. And then we take that and we reduce that. And sometimes we go talk to a supervisor or a colleague, and now it's a 6 or 4 minute version of what these people's lives are. And so it matters the kind of terms we use as we describe them, just in the ways Steve's mentioned, whether it's diagnoses or nicknames, or you hear people sometimes get sarcastic or even cruel towards clients. And we've all heard that and maybe done that at times. But I remember hearing a description of Michael White, narrative therapist and theorist. And the description was this. They said he never comes out of a session and then speaks in different kinds of terms about the client. He doesn't say, man, can you believe that guy? That's just wasn't who he was. And I think that's part of his power, right? Is that he just genuinely sees people in these kinds of respectful, kind, I, thou ways. And in his case, he has these theoretical ways of separating people out from the things that they're struggling with. So anyway, that I think is a big one. As therapists, we have to just think carefully about the way we describe. And then the second one, which I refer to, is just that we can help others do that as clients. Like we can help couples do that with each other. And that's partially what this article is about, is helping couples think in more relational terms, because it is hard. We all get overwhelmed. We get our feelings hurt. We get angry. And when we do that, we tend to shift into more of a defensive, it, protective posture. And that's one of the things I think good couples therapy does, is it helps people slow down. It helps people experiencing each other in richer, fuller, more accurate ways. People will hear each other's pain beneath the behavior. They will hear each other's histories and things like that. And that helps them connect again in ways that maybe they haven't.
What you said, Jason, made me think about, this has gone back a little bit in our conversation, but as therapists, our way of relating to clients, an it way could manifest itself in how we react to a client that's not making progress. Sometimes we want our clients to like us. We want good things to happen. If clients aren't making progress, then we might feel like our superstar therapist stats are going down, and we might get a little frustrated with clients. And so we may be relating to clients in an it way when we base our therapist's self-esteem on clients' progress or not. So yeah, we need to be careful about how we regard clients. We want to see progress. We want clients to do well. And the models that we use as we use them in the service of our clients can help us with that. The first article we wrote on the therapeutic pyramid, models and techniques, are right at the top. But it's we say that's the smallest kind of component of successful therapy, is the models and techniques. There's deeper and more kind of impactful aspects of what we do as therapists, including the alliance and then our way of being. But therapy would be incomplete without a good plan or a good model to guide us in the service of our clients. And anyway, I just thought I'd toss that in, because what you said, Jason, reminded me of some experiences I've had where I've got the pyramid upside down or got sideways with my clients.
Again, so many wonderful things I can expound on as you all are talking about that, as we move into what this looks like both in the therapy room and in the classroom training therapists. One of the ways, I've never told you all this, that I introduce the concept is when I'm teaching a history class or the theories class, where I think of the way our field started, and I think of the origin of studying patterns of communication led to the Bateson Project, which led to MRI, where they were studying patterns of communication. and they were studying feedback loops. And then they'd go outside of the room and they'd talk about it and come up with an intervention, something they're doing to the client system. Therapist responsible for change. So I introduced that early on as a way of an MFT, I-it thinking. And then as we move toward the evolution into the postmodern movement, as you mentioned, Michael White always being consistent, and you're right, and no longer therapist as expert, but client as expert in a collaborative endeavor, in a conversation back and forth in some of our favorite postmodern approaches. And that is really the shift to I-thou. So as you guys were saying that, as we start talking about training, that's the way I introduce it, even before I have them read your series of articles. And that does seem to resonate on our profession and the evolution. Since I've never shared that with you all, I'm curious what you think about that overlay.
What that makes me think of, and maybe Steve, you should share this example, is when Jay Haley came and spoke to some students, and Steve was there as part of that conversation. And we cite this in our 2014 original pyramid article, but he's known as being this technical virtuoso. He's really brilliant at understanding and intervening, but the reputation is one that was pretty I-it.
The poster boy for I-it. Yeah.
He has to outsmart and jump in and use a heavy hammer to blast apart these dysfunctional patterns. But Steve, why don't you share that story of when you were asking him a question about his experience and what he learned throughout his career?
Yeah, that was super interesting. And I really enjoyed the conversation. He just came and he was visiting our university and he set aside an hour. I thought he was going to give a presentation on strategic therapy. And the way that my reading of it and the way that it had been presented, I didn't have a super positive opinion of it, but I was curious to meet him. So he just said, yeah, I'd love to answer any questions that you have. And so there was a lot of great question and answer. And some of the things that he said with what I learned about it, but he as a person didn't come across in the way that I expected. And he was just really delightful. We were just about done. And the faculty that was kind of conducting the discussion said, does anyone have any last questions? We got time for one more. And no one was raising their hand. So I decided I'd ask a second question. I said, if there was one thing that you would hope a graduate student learns before they finish their program, what would that be? Without any hesitation, he said kindness. And that surprised me because I didn't, again, my reading of strategic, that it wasn't very kind, but he said kindness. And then he said, the most important thing about strategic therapy is the therapeutic relationship. And you have to care about your clients. And he said that the way that it's often presented, it's just these sometimes seemingly outrageous interventions, and no one spends any time talking about the two most important things about strategic therapy. One is listening. So we emphasize like these interventions and the directives. He says listening and the relationship are the two most important things about strategic therapy. And man, my view of strategic therapy totally changed. I didn't become a strategic therapist, but it was genuinely, I felt his authenticity, and that's where he was when he did therapy, like truly caring about the clients and working hard to build that relationship. And that's, then these interventions maybe certainly would come from that place, from that relationship, not just out of the blue.
I think that's really fascinating. This person that has spent a lifetime of this kind of work, and that's what he says needs to be emphasized. And it reminds me of when I read Eastern philosophy or Buddhism or other things, and they talk about this deep listening and how you can't understand a person, let alone love them, unless you really are in this position of I-thou. They don't use that language exactly, but it's this deep interest in and respect for the other persons. And I've heard Jay Haley's example is a good one. I remember hearing Salvador Minuchin. This was in an article in the Networker where he similarly said, he was in his maybe 90s at that point. And he said, I've softened on some of my earlier theoretical intervention approaches to be a little more respectful and a little more curious, not knowing, and just wanting to understand the people. And I've just heard other people say that. So I just think, especially for a therapist in training, it's important to remember because there's a lot of anxiety around becoming a therapist. It's a stressful profession. It's a big responsibility. And sometimes we are signing up to say, hey, I want to have a cool intervention like that, or tell me how you did that technique. And that's all well and good. But if you don't start with this fundamental respect, then the technique is just going to be that. It's just going to be a tool in a bag and not flow naturally out of what's best for the client.
Yeah, it makes me think of what we've been talking about, the language and we use in your current article, the family process article about working with couples. So if we use this language and we model it for the couples, it becomes a parallel process, an isomorphic way, the way we treat couples, and then they treat each other from this stance. So yeah, I'm really enjoying our conversation so far. We mentioned therapists in training. So how do you guys think we can be reflective on our own way of being, both in our own supervision, if we're professionally young, like many of our listeners are, or in our own self-reflection, self-supervision, if we're a more seasoned systemic therapist?
Yeah, I know, Eli, the role of being a faculty and training students. And in our programs, we put a big emphasis on learning the models. And that's at multiple levels in our programs and in our learning outcomes for accreditation. And then the national licensing exam, there's a lot of emphasis on learning models. And again, not that models are bad, but it maybe gives the impression that the models are the key ingredient to successful therapy. Like the correct application of a model is what has the biggest impact on change. And you as a common factors scholar and us, we know that empirically, there's other factors that have a lot greater impact on the outcome, and including the alliance. And in our article, we propose this way of being as the foundation, or kind of where it's the grounding of the alliance. So I think right from the start, we should be teaching this to our students and helping them understand these common ingredients of successful therapy while they're also learning the models. The other thing about being a teacher, Sean Davis, I love him and we love the work that we've been able to do with Sean. And he shared a story one time where we were talking about being a teacher. And sometimes, it can be tough. We've multiple demands of teaching and research and maybe administrative responsibilities. And we're advising students on their thesis or dissertation research. And we might have our own private practice and we might have relationships outside of academia. So there's a lot going on in our lives. And Sean said, man, one of the things that's the absolute worst is when you have to sit down and grade papers and you're in an I place towards your students. That's the most miserable teaching experience or academic experience. And then he said he's learned to really sit down and take a minute to think about his students carefully as people and get himself in an I-thou place. And he said, grading is so much more enjoyable when you're in an I-thou place. It's totally different. And I was so glad that he shared that with me, because I think I had slipped into a habit of seeing grading as this necessary evil that I just have to do so I can get back to what I really want to do, which is some other activity. And I was being towards my students. And it's not fun. It's not enjoyable. And my grading probably wasn't very helpful in terms of helping them improve themselves as therapists or as scholars. So it does make a difference in different domains of our work, whether we're doing research or teaching or therapy. Our way of being towards others can make a big difference.
Yeah, I like that example of grading, because when we shifted to that mode of, this is a burden, that's different than this is an opportunity to teach and to provide something or to enter into a dialogue with a student. And the other thing about students, and maybe all of us, because we're all students at some level, but it's easy, like I was saying earlier, to have some anxiety about looking competent. And it's also easy to then worry about what other people are thinking about you, if that makes sense. And so if you're in front of the mirror, for example, or if you are being judged, as that happens in an academic setting, there's evaluative kinds of things going on. So anyway, that also can just get in the way. And I think we can help students to shift back into a mode of be in that moment with the people in front of you. Don't worry about appearing a certain way or trying to pull off an intervention in a certain way. That's less important. And again, we can be that way as professors too. We can worry about showing up and looking competent or looking incompetent. And that's less helpful than just showing up and saying, what can I do to be most helpful and most relational at this point?
Yeah, a big shout out to our friend and colleague, Sean Davis. I have learned so much from him over the last 2 decades, and he's a great storyteller too. He has a way of capturing these moments, and that's a great way to think about it. I also think of the cohorts that I have trained. It's not necessarily having to do with size, but the ones I've had the best experiences with, where I could stay in I, thou the longest, which again is another way of modeling, whether it be for our students or our clients, because if we can't do it, it's really hard to expect them to do it. One other concept that I really liked in the Family Process article, which is I think a newer addition to how you guys have been thinking, is the concept of strong relationality. Please tell our listeners about that and how that fits into our dialogue today.
We've talked about some of the philosophers that have been influential in this, Martin Buber, Emmanuel Levinas, and then we've worked with others in our professional associations who've written about this idea of strong relationality. And to simplify, we as a Western culture are very individualistic in the way we think. Our legal system is very individualistic. It focuses on individual rights. We are competitive. We see ourselves as individual containers moving around within a big space and bumping into other individual containers. And that's how we treat medically. That's how we think in terms of therapy. But a strong relationality approach philosophically would say we're actually not individuals per se. We are fundamentally relational, and we are created in relational ways, and we develop our identity in relational ways. And as we interact with others, it transforms who we are. So rather than just this individual container, we're like a knot in a whole web of other knots in the web. We interact, for example, as we become into an intimate relationship or a marriage, something like that. We and neurobiology and other kinds of sciences are discovering this more and more, that we change each other. And that happens as we figure out who we are and as we interact with others. So all that is to say, we can't just consider ourselves as this individual entity. We have to think in relational terms. And what that means is our interactions are ethical, for example. The things we do matter. They matter to other people, and the things other people do matter to us. So starting from that foundation helps us think a little bit differently. And it doesn't always come intuitively, especially in our culture and especially as we interact with relationships and we're trying to help other people think more relationally, especially when those people have become individualistically focused in the way they are defensive or aggressive or whatever. So it's just this little philosophical shift, but I think ultimately it can make a small difference and sometimes it can make a big difference.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think this idea of being fundamentally relational beings does have quite a bit of implications. Just this week, Eli, I was given a guest lecture in the business school to a class on family businesses, so family-owned businesses. And they wanted me to come in and talk about, the intersection between the family relationships and the work relationships. And I shared some of the things we've been talking about today with Martin Buber's I, thou, and I, it, and the different ways of being. And we talked about how the principles of successful family relationships are the same as principles of successful business relationships, and the ways in which families might struggle in their relationships, the origins of those are the same as the ways that business relationships struggle. And then they asked me, what about, and the professor of the class and the students had done some case studies where these family businesses, they had started out going through the hard times together, struggling to get a business off the ground, really strong partners, the husband and wife, if it was a marital couple that was building the business. And then they have success, and then have a lot of success and make a lot of money, and then they divorce. And they say, what happened in those cases? Did they turn it to each other? And we talked about, I don't have any research data on this, but we talked about how, when you start to have success, then you start to be related to by others outside in more and more objectified ways. People want to interact with you because of what they can get from you. I also do research on professional athletes and marriage. And, that happens in the athletes' lives all the time. People want to hang around with them to get a piece of their fame or to get a piece of their money. And so when you start to live in an objectified world and be treated as an object, this is the strong relationality is not just one type of relationship. It says that we're connected to other people in lots of different ways and we're influenced by them. And so when you live in a world of objectification, then you may start drinking that Kool-Aid, so to speak, and start to relate to others in more objectified ways, including your partner. And that could be part of, it's not the money that ruins the relationship, it's the way that the relationship changes, the way you do the relationship with each other. But I just found that really interesting. I did not expect that discussion to go that direction, but there's this intimate connection that we have with each other. And like Jason said, that comes with ethical obligations of how we ought to treat one another. And we believe that we, as human beings, we have a sense of how we ought to treat others. And when we honor that sense, good things usually happen. When we betray that or when we go against it, then it creates challenges in the relationships and our influence on others is less than ideal.
I can't thank you guys enough. This has been one of the most thought-provoking, I think, grounding and reaffirming conversations I've had on the podcast in a long time, as far as reminding probably not just me, many of our listeners of what we do and why we do it. And when couple and family therapy, systemic therapy works, what is really the core and the common ingredients, certainly much more, as you were saying, Steve, than any model. So, man, people will want to continue the dialogue, tell everybody the best way to get a hold of you guys if they want to do that. And then certainly we shouted out to our friend Sean Davis, also former guest of the show, but anybody else you want to mention in this team of great practitioner scientists, MFTs, certainly feel free to shout out, and you guys can plug anything you want to here at the end, but your parting words, go ahead.
Yeah, I did also want to mention Steve and I met 23 years ago in Kentucky. And then another colleague showed up, Kay Bradford. And so he started, collaborating with us. And then Sean showed up. And so the four of us have both together and then along with other collaborations worked on some of these things. So it was that University of Kentucky connection back in the early 2000s that started all this. But to your point about what matters most, I would just sum up by saying what we do, it's a privilege and it is a responsibility. Our time with people really matters to them. And sometimes I think we can forget that also as we get into an I-IT, just professional stance. But these spaces where we interact with people and the way we are with them can change lives and they can be really powerful. And sometimes I teach this class with master's students and it's on addiction and violence. And so it's a heavy topic. And I ask them to read articles about things like stalking or sexual assault or child maltreatment or abuse. And it's heavy and it's hard. And they say, man, this is discouraging stuff. And what's wrong with the human species? And I say, you're right. It is heavy. And it's a good question to ask what's going wrong, but it's also really important. And if we shift into an I-IT mode of, I don't want to read this, don't bother me because it's too unpleasant for me, that's a problem in and of itself, because we can wade into these issues and we may not be able to solve all these problems. We might be sitting with someone and saying, you're right, this is a terrible issue and I feel for you. But by doing that, we've accomplished a lot, even without solving it or fixing it. And we can, if we're not doing that, who's doing that? So sometimes I have to remind myself and others, even if I have someone in front of me who has done things that I really disagree with or they've been damaging to others, they're still human. And if I shift into an angry battle mode with them, of course that comes across. And as Steve was saying earlier, bad things happen when you shift in an I-IT mode, but good things happen when we're in an I-thou mode. And we can be that. And I'm sure you and all of us have had the experience where we've listened to somebody and we've said, I don't think I can fix this. This is just really hard stuff. But then it was a good session because that person was grateful for us for just sitting with them and being it. So all that is to say, I think what we do matters. We can be relational in how we do it. And it's really a great a great honor and a privilege to be in this profession.
Yeah. Amen, brother. I was thinking about a couple of things in addition to, just being grateful for Jason and Kay Bradford and Sean Davis that we've been able to collaborate. Two professors that really had an impact on me. One is Brent Slife. We cite him a few times in our articles, and he really helped us understand a relational view of human beings. And then a guy named Terry Warner, another professor, and someone that has had a big influence on our thinking around these issues. Really appreciate them. Eli, you said, how do we do this? How do we work on our own way of being? Be self-reflective about it. And one of the things I appreciate the most is the opportunity to have discussions about way of being with my students or with clients. I don't always use that exact phrase with clients, or I it or I thou. Sometimes I will, but still talking about way of being in other ways, inviting them to be self-reflective. I find myself inviting myself. I am asking myself the same questions, and we wrestle with some of these same issues or challenges because of our human frailties. It's not like there's the good people, the I, thou people, and the bad people, I, it. It's all of us, right? We find ourselves moving back and forth. And so I try to be reflective and invite my students to be self-reflective, and not just one time, but do that on a regular basis. And I think for me anyway, it helps me recover. If I've slipped into the I, it kind of area too much, it helps me recover the I, thou to think carefully about how am I regarding this person, or how am I relating to my students or my family and things like that. I agree with Jason. It's a privilege to be in the profession of marriage and family therapy, both as a therapist and as a faculty and as a lifelong learner. I love the opportunity to continue to learn in academics. It's one of the best parts of this job.
I'm not going to say it any better than that, gentlemen. Thank you so much. How are they going to contact you if our listeners want to continue the dialogue?
I think most of us are easy to find. Just Google our names or our universities. And I do have a website. It's drjasonwhiding.com, where I share some things that I've written about, and some blogs and a book that I've written, things like that. But always happy to hear from people if they have questions or thoughts. So yeah, I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome any feedback, any questions or thoughts that people have. And probably the best way to reach me is through my university website or my email, steven.fife@ttu.edu. And Eli, I appreciate again the conversation today.
Yeah, it's been great.
Thank you, guys. Eli, back with you, bringing to a close another informative installment of the AAMFT podcast. Did you know that AAMFT is active on all your favorite social media channels? Be sure to follow us, the AAMFT, on Instagram, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And you want to stay up to date with everything going on in the world of AAMFT, you can always find the back installments of the podcast anywhere you find your favorite podcast. I am partial to Apple Podcast and Spotify, but it's on Google Play, Stitcher. So please, if you're new to us, check out back installments where we tackle the latest trends and events impacting the world of systemic therapy, like today. And I have a number of pioneer interviews, which is some of my favorite interviews to conduct over the years. You can drop me a line at elikaram.com, where you see everything going on in my world, including 2 books that are out. One for our young professionals, Marriage and Family Therapy, a National Exam, Your Guide for Success. That's from Springer. And that will prepare you for the national exam, including 360 practice questions, a full-length mock exam, proven strategies and tips for test taking, and it's organized to match the domains of the licensure exam. And then, if you're interested in these common factors that we always talk about on the show, including what makes a motivated client, how you build, nurture, and repair a therapeutic alliance, how you maximize your own therapist factors. You want to check out my book, Bringing Common Factors to Life in Couple and Family Therapy from Rutledge. As always, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, my friends, stay safe, stay systemic.
Stay systemic, my friend.
With Dr. Eli, AAMFT show. The latest insights level. Couples family therapy. Helping with feelings. Stay systemic, my friend. To be like education. Innovating again. Stay systemic, my friend. 2 weekly, hear the latest debate. With our guests and topics we illuminate. From theory to practice,